Welcome to the church library. Draw up a chair and join us as we sort through these stacks of old books. I'm Marissa Burt.
And I'm Kelsey McGinnis. And here in the church library, we host conversations about popular Christian books. This season, we are dusting off Christian parenting resources.
Our book, The Myth of Good Christian Parenting, How False Promises Betrayed a Generation of Evangelical Families, examines many of these books, the obscure, the bestsellers, the ones that still pop up in church parenting classes.
Let's see what's on the bookshelves today.
Hey, Kelsey, good to see you here in the church library.
So good to see you too. What are we looking at today?
Well, today we are looking at the book Jesus the Gentle Parent, Gentle Christian Parenting by L.R. Knost, which kind of springboards a whole conversation around gentle parenting and its predecessor, attachment parenting, and how these have both shown up in Christian spaces.
Gentle parenting. The thing that is ruining all of the children. Right? I feel like as a millennial, everybody wants me to know that gentle parenting is ruining the kids.
It's to blame, yes.
I think every month I see another think piece about how bad gentle parenting is. And in particular, like from the is gentle parenting, can it be biblical? Is it biblical?
Yes, those two just crop up again and again all the time on Instagram. I probably see something at least once a week, and certainly in other outlets, podcasts and online articles. And yes, this is a question that's been in the water. It's one we've talked about a bit before, but I am excited today because I think looking at these resources will kind of help spotlight the ways this is a very current conversation in the moment, but it's also an old conversation that people have been having in different forms.
Right. Well, and I was going to say, you said this book came out in the early 2000s?
So kind early-ish, right? Like depends on when you mark it. It came out, I think, in 2014.
Oh, okay.
But so right in the early days of what would become gentle parenting.
Interesting.
But it kind of came as a wave with the attachment parenting, the Christian attachment parenting movement that really was in the water in the 90s and early 2000s. So, which sounds recent, but when you think about it, that's over the past 30 years, there have been voices publishing and creating online communities discussing gentler ways to parent, including some of the common ingredients we see in today's gentle parenting. So where should we start? Should we start with trying to define gentle parenting? Should we start with attachment parenting? Should we start with the book? What do you think?
Well, so I'm curious to know how L.R. Knost defines gentle parenting. For me, one of probably the thing that annoys me most about gentle parenting discourse is not that I particularly ascribe to gentle parenting. It's that I don't know what that is. And I'm not convinced that anyone who hates it knows what it is either.
Right.
Because there does not seem to be a stable definition. It seems to be, to me, at least from critics, a particular perception of passivity and over coddling, but it doesn't seem like that's rooted in what any particular parenting expert is recommending. So how does she articulate what it is?
Yeah, that's good. Well, and just one more thought on what you're saying. Yeah, any critique often is usually full of straw men, right? Because I think you are not alone. I think gentle parenting isn't a very precisely defined philosophy. So when you go back to her book, this is on page 33. She is going to give some bullet points here of approaches that parents could use. She says, model instead of manipulate, invite instead of intimidate, support instead of shame, encourage instead of enrage, teach instead of threaten, listen instead of lecture, help instead of hurt, parent instead of punish. And she kind of says there are 3 C's of gentle parenting: connection, communication, and cooperation. So I don't know if she ever, it's been a while since I read this. I'm looking at my margin notes. I don't think she ever has like necessarily a sentence that says gentle parenting equals. But this is also before we even see the term gentle parenting really being used, because right around this same time, Sarah Ockwell Smith is writing in the secular parenting sphere about empathy, respect, understanding, boundaries. In 2012, Sarah Ockwell Smith publishes Baby Calm, her first book, and she goes on a few years later to publish a Gentle Sleep book. And she is somebody people point to as the person who coined the term gentle parenting. Now, you can see on the timeline, L.R. Knost wrote this book, Jesus the Gentle Parent, subtitled Gentle Christian Parenting, in 2014. So right around that same time. So it's hard to say like who came up with the term. I think it's fair to say these ideas were in the water from attachment parenting. And the early gentle parenting books really lean heavily into attachment parenting principles. So I don't even know. It would be interesting if L.R. Knost would identify writing this book to coin a new framework. I really get the impression reading it, she's pulling the term gentle parent fresh to say, let's have a pushback to authoritarian Christian parenting philosophies. And she critiques a lot of them in her book. A lot of the ones we have talked about and looked at, she critiques in this book. And her first chapter is Jesus, the Gentle Parent. So she's really starting with saying, look, I want to invite Christians to look at how Jesus interacts with people, and that should frame our parenting. So I'm not so sure she was even setting out to frame a parenting philosophy so much as pushback at what was going on in what Christian parents were being fed.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So does she lean on William Sears and attachment parenting? Does that come up in the book very much?
It does. I don't know if she ever quotes William Sears, but she definitely includes a lot of attachment parenting. Like her book, this book, and she wrote a couple others around this time for very young children. Maybe I printed them off. Like one I think is called like Butterfly 2,000 Kisses a Day or something for parenting very young children. She writes a lot about breastfeeding and co-sleeping, baby wearing, those kind of things in this book, which is notable just because if you go on Instagram and look for gentle parenting today, those aren't necessarily ingredients you find. You find, right? Like you find scripts more about communication, about verbalizing feelings, about staying connected. Those ingredients are still there. But the things that I think would be more identifiably attachment parenting aren't necessarily part of gentle parenting today.
Okay.
Maybe with a few exceptions. So I think that's interesting. And I should say there's one more predecessor to this. There was an online forum for a number of years called Gentle Christian Mothers that a lot of people we talked to, or at least I talked to for our book, and also just other mothers I know around my age, mid-40s, discovered in the late 90s, early 2000s as kind of an online forum that was offering an alternative to spanking children, really is, I think, the origin of it. And it became a really robust online community. This was in the days of like mommy bloggers, and so pre-social media, but it became a real point of connection for parents, particularly women, who were saying, we don't want to do this with our babies. We don't want to spank our toddlers. We're not comfortable with that. And many of them had been introduced to more attachment parenting ideas through pediatricians, through the Leche League, things like that. So they were saying, as Christian mothers, corporal punishment is a thing that really seems at odds with these other maybe secondary approaches we're taking. And so it became a community, ended up dissolving, but it became a community that I think really changed a lot of people's minds. So that's kind of what I mean when I say I think these ideas were in the water, but it's hard to rewind, especially if you are a millennial parent. I think it's hard to rewind to the pre-social media days and envision what that was like to be parenting, where you had your books, maybe you had radio programs like Focus on the Families putting out things like that, CDs or tape series like Growing Kids God's Way might have put out. And then you began to have alternative opinions, more grassroots in online forums. That was huge. That was huge, I think, for a lot of parents.
Yeah. So when you were parenting your
Hold it.
oldest,
Yeah, yeah.
was attachment parenting the thing? Was that like the thing in the water?
It was a thing. I think
Okay.
it was for sure. I think this is just my experience, right? But I think for sure every mom had heard of it, right? Like co-sleeping, baby wearing, breastfeeding longer. That was significant. Even I remember with some of my older kids, it was right at the hospitals were changing from there's a baby nursery on labor and delivery floor to rooming in was like that was an option. You could keep your baby with you. That was novel, which feels wild now, but that was like unconventional because most of the time they just come take your baby to the nursery while you recovered. So things like that were seeping into the broader culture. And then you still had people, like I remember mom friends, you still had people who were all in on that, whether it's cloth diapering or baby wearing or co-sleeping. But I think you had the tension, right? These were the heady days of baby wise as well. So I think you had the mommy wars of, are you going to be child-led eating, child-led weaning, child-led all of that? Or are you going to be parent-led? Like, is the parent going to have the authority like the Ezos were saying? So yeah, it definitely was in the water. I read Jesus the Gentle Parent.
Mm.
Gosh, that I would have had young children when this came out. So yeah, I had some young children. I still had some babies. So I remember reading it and finding it refreshing. Yeah. Was attachment parenting a thing when you became a parent?
I mean, I became a parent during the Instagram era, right? And
Okay.
I feel like by the time moms are on Instagram, attachment parent, like baby wearing is still a thing, but I think like you're kind of describing a two camp mommy wars.
Mm-hmm.
Instagram allows it to be like mom tribes, right?
That's
Like you
true.
can find every niche
Yep.
concern. Crunchy moms, attachment moms, disciplinarian moms, biblical motherhood moms,
Yeah.
like every kind of thing. So I feel like they're like a little bit less defined.
Yep.
One of the first books that was given to me was by an old boss
Hmm.
who was probably well, not more, very much in the attachment
Okay.
parenting world, very much. And she gave me, I think, a stack of she was a box of 15 books, like
Oh,
on
wow.
breastfeeding, the pregnancy and birth version of Our Bodies Ourselves,
Oh, wow.
the Sears book. I mean, just a ton of books.
Yeah.
And she was maybe 10 years older than me and
Okay.
had one child and was very much into all of that. I think she
Yeah.
had planned to have like a home birth and had kind of a traumatic experience, but I mean, there were just a lot of interesting things about her story, and she had all of these books that were very about attachment. But she was the only person I remember talking to about attachment parenting, because
Oh,
by then
interesting.
I I think you had the gentle parenting, at least the tribe of it. Even
Mhm.
though most of the people who get associated with gentle parenting would not even say that's what they're
Right.
doing. Like Janet Lansbury would say, this is respectful parenting.
Right.
Dr. Becky Kennedy, who is
Yeah.
the author of the book Good Inside, she would say she's not a gentle parenting
Right.
person. She's doing something else. But I
Yeah.
think to critics, what all these
Yep.
people are doing is gentle parenting,
Yep.
because they are very much on the non-punitive parenting
Hmm.
side of things.
Yeah.
And they are also all about these scripts for communication, all about welcoming feelings, affirming feelings, these kind of, there are certainly similar themes that get swept up in what people think of when they think of gentle parenting.
I think so. And I think really the key child-centric focus is a piece of what in Christian conversations people bristle over.
100%.
Like children are taking up too much space. They're controlling parents. They're allowed to do whatever they want to do. It's too permissive. Like there's a whole number of things, but I think at the core, it's really this sense of like we talked about last week, that's not God's order for the household, that a child would have a say, really. Mm-hmm. So I think that crops up a lot in the Christian resources. I do think in the earlier days, it's interesting that you said you got a stack of 15 books, because I do think books were huge, but also it was a little bit harder to go against the current, I think. I mean, it's been interesting to parent over what feels like 2 generations. Like I kind of straddle those to have, my older kids were kind of in a little cluster of 3. And I feel like we're firmly in, I was parenting with other Gen X parents. And then my younger 3, I felt like, oh, I'm parenting with millennial parents now. And it's interesting to have that spread, because I know by the time I went for round 2 with the younger kids, like it was a new idea when I heard other parents talking about like timeout may not be a good thing. Like that was a new idea. I was like, oh, I had no idea. And because I'd been out of the conversation for several years. So it's funny how many of those things trend, but also in the earlier days, you didn't have your tribe. So you would read these books that would maybe empower you. Or you'd find like La Leche League that would maybe empower you in a certain way, but it was difficult to go against the stream because you were a little bit more isolated. So, I don't know. It's interesting to think about how more information has opened up more doors for connection, but also more information that can be overwhelming, more ways to do it right, more ways to do it wrong, that feeling, people telling you that. So anyway, it's interesting. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one other thing to say about the attachment parenting. So I don't know if we'll do an episode on him, but Dr. William Sears is kind of pinpointed as the person who started attachment parenting. Though again, there's always more than just one person going at it. He's a doctor. He didn't really write a lot of Christian resources, but he has a Catholic background. He trained in seminary and was going to be a priest and decided he wanted to have a family. And I think he had 8 children with his wife, Martha, who's a nurse. So they brought this interesting claim to authority that I think we see in the 80s and 90s of, look, here's a pediatrician, here's a medical doctor, a medical nurse writing about child health, child well-being, child discipline, but from an attachment parenting oriented perspective. And I think he changed the conversation around parenting in America in a number of ways. He got a lot of pushback, as did a lot of attachment parenting people, for how much it put on parents and how burnt out some parents felt doing all of this, co-sleeping, baby wearing, like nursing, like just how intensive it was. But to my knowledge, I don't know how much he's still writing and speaking or engaged. That would be interesting to look up. But I think his resources still circulate a little bit.
Yeah, they definitely do. And he did write a Christian parenting book, the complete book of Christian parenting and childcare.
Oh, yeah, I see that.
A medical and moral guide to raising happy, healthy children.
Yeah. So that was his one. Well, and I have on my shelves The Discipline book, which is a fascinating foil to a lot of the other resources on discipline, because it's from an attachment parenting perspective, and it's big. I mean, it's a thick one. Can you see it here? I'll show you.
Yeah.
But what's so interesting is he does have several chapters on child development and a long section at the end on He calls it Discipline for Special Times and Special Children, which is rare in, and I get it, I wouldn't categorize this as a Christian parenting book necessarily, but it's rare in Christian parenting resources to have any discussion for the unique needs of categories of children. He talks about hyperactive children and special needs children according to the terminology of the day, and shy children, and I think they themselves had a child with Down syndrome, and so probably were more personally aware of there's not one size fits all here for children. So anyway, it's an interesting one that I think has influenced a lot of the gentle parenting movement. I think probably Dr. Sears' ideas have in unidentifiable ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned that Jesus the Gentle Parent, that book,
Yes.
is very obviously kind of responding to the popular Christian parenting literature that
Yes.
preceded it. Who does she respond to directly?
Yeah, she responds to a lot of the big ones. She responds to the Pearls books, To Train Up a Child. She talks about Ted Tripp's book, Shepherding a Child's Heart. She talks about Gary Ezzo and James Dobson's stuff. And she also talks about some of the theology. She talks about views on sin and how they show up in these resources. She talks a lot about spanking. And makes a case obviously against spanking, biblically speaking. And her book is interesting because it's self-published. And so that really shows in that it feels like a collection of maybe blog posts or her writings and reflections. So it's a little bit more difficult to categorize it because I think it's like 20 short chapters long. So it is organized, and she does include parenting through the different stages, but it reads more like a blog put to print. So
Interesting.
it's not like she has one chapter on Ted Tripp or something, but she'll reference him at different points throughout.
Do we know anything about her like training and academic background? Like, what's
I
the
pulled it
credentialing
up.
here?
She is a mom. She's still actually, I pulled it up and then I tried to print it, but it had this big black background. So I didn't want to print it off. But she still actually is quite active. She has a terminal, a rare, untreatable, I think is how she describes it, cancer. So she is kind of dealing with chronic illness. So she's kind of on and off social media. But when she was writing or actively, she had a support team that included an elementary school teacher, a school administrator with a master's degree in educational leadership, a family therapist with a background in early child education, and an artist and illustrator. So she, I don't think, has specific qualifications, at least she doesn't write about them, beyond being the parent to 6 children and an author, an advocate. But it sounds like she brought together a team that maybe filled in some of those gaps.
Interesting.
For her writing. But a lot of it reads very much as her personal reflections.
Sure. So self-published. To some degree, self-platformed. I mean, this is sort of like we try to kind of hold feet to the fire in terms of self-platforming when we offer parenting advice or when an author does.
Yeah, I'm looking at her book as well. Yep, she does not have any. She describes herself as an independent child development researcher and founder and director of an advocacy and consulting group, and a monthly contributor to the Natural Parent magazine. So similarly to many self-platform people, that can sound really impressive. It sounds like a lot of credentials, but it really is. She has built a readership,
right? And it's not that is necessarily a nothing this person has to say is valuable. It's just I think it's always worth asking the question, because anytime you are offering parenting advice is in the Christian realm and kind of making claims about the person of Jesus and making claims about the nature of parenting and the nature of children, that's just such a, I mean, that's such a hard area to speak into. And I'm always a little wary of anyone who speaks into it with a lot of confidence. You know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Yeah. Well, and that's really the reality that we talk about a lot when we try and deflate claims that hold such biblical certainty down to someone's opinion or interpretation, because that's really what is most of the time going on. And that's not to say that there can't be a good interpretation and opinion or a helpful one, but it's I think really important, especially when people are making claims to spiritual authority, to say this is someone who has their own lens they're bringing to this, their own interpretive lens for how they're approaching scripture, their own theological lens, their own experiential lens. So at the very least, we should be reading with that in mind.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, probably for us to sort of cards on the table, given that she is writing from the perspective against authoritarian parenting and against the use of spanking and corporal punishment, we probably are more amenable to agree with some of the theological claims she's making. But I'm curious for you, as the one of us that has the theological training, did you find her arguments for her approaches convincing?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think I found, and I remember this when I first read it as a new mom, I just found it refreshing to have someone drawing on some of the other passages and bringing a different perspective. Because as we've talked about, and as we can see on our shelves, it can be kind of one note in Christian parenting, especially through the 80s and 90s and 2000s in the resources. There just aren't that many that are inviting parents to maybe a different framework. So I think so. I mean, if I were in a mind to go through and try and really critique with a red pen, there would be things I could find fault with. I am really less inclined to do that with resources that are not actively putting children in danger because of these things. I think it's the same is true with gentle parenting. In general, the people making these arguments and claims do come with slightly less certainty. They are more willing to entertain the thought that there could be other perspectives, which is a piece of typically their framework. So I think that makes it all a little bit more digestible as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, and they come more willing to question their own sense of things.
Yes.
I think gentle parenting gets criticized a lot for passive parents or lazy parents, when at least what I see in a lot of call it what you want, mindful parenting, respectful parenting. Some people try to call it authoritative parenting. I don't know. But a lot of it comes with a posture of maybe I'm wrong, or maybe I need to listen to what my kid needs here. Maybe it's okay if my toddler throws a tantrum. Maybe and I think those, for a lot of people who really firmly believe in what kind of old guard Christian parenting resources teach, those things are kind of non-starters.
Yep.
No, it's not okay. No, that it is not okay to let your child have a tantrum, or it's not okay to, question whether you should actually be making your child do something. Their job is to obey, as we talked about last week with the Christian family, right? If you have read books where the teaching is explicitly the one job of your child is to learn to obey you, everything else follows from their ability to do that. Well, then it doesn't really matter what your child may think of X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, it's irrelevant.
And it doesn't matter how they feel about what you're asking them to do either.
Right.
So yeah, I do find that frustrating. I feel like Christian critics of gentle parenting and folks from this camp of attachment parenting, gentle parenting, talk past each other quite a bit for that exact reason. Because
I think so. And I think we talk about this in our book, The Myth of Good Christian Parenting, that an interesting dynamic when you read a bunch of these resources is you see that the readers are, in a sense, being parented by the methodology the authors are holding forth. And you really get that sense in this book. There's a lot of invitation to curiosity. There's a lot of questions. And that's a stark contrast to maybe a Christensen book, a Dobson book, a Tripp book that's saying, this is God's way and I'm laying it out for you. Or this is common sense parenting and get on board. And I think the same thing happens in these conversations for sure when people are critiquing them. And I don't know, there's something that I think certain corners of Christian parenting experts, I guess, for lack of a better word, find threatening about gentle parenting, because the level of heat at which people respond to it is noteworthy. Like you said at the beginning, whether it's this is what is ruining kids these days, or this kind of vehement, this is something we need to actively speak out against, gentle parenting. It's not a neutral option. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that is?
So I think one big reason is that most parenting influencers, writers, experts in this area do not use the word sin to describe child behavior. Yeah. I think that is a really big issue that a lot of Christian parents take. And I think when I read criticisms, that is one that is leveled against it again and again, is this does not teach your children to identify and address their sin. This does not teach repentance. It does not teach them right and wrong. And I think the lack of interest in identifying that, it makes it seem like this cannot be a good approach. So that's my sense of like the big one.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Yeah, and when my oldest was a toddler, I remember having a real reckoning within myself about this question. Like, what am I supposed to be, how much am I supposed to be thinking about sin? Was my question. Yeah. How much am I supposed to be thinking about that? And I did not have a good answer as a new parent. I just was floundering, looking for something.
Yeah, and I think that really encapsulates what a lot of parents experience, in that it can shake some theological assumptions up in ways that can be unnerving. Because if you dig a little deeper underneath that question, you begin to ask, well, what is sin? And that can be unmooring, because some of us maybe were only given like a one sentence definition, like sin is missing the mark or something. And so we have maybe rote answers for that, but looking at a 2 or 3-year-old and saying, is a mistake sin? Is a failure to be perfect sin? Like, what is sin? And then if there's not that moment of curiosity, everything gets lumped into that category. So any child behavior, any undesirable child behavior becomes sin. And you see that reflected in a lot of the resources that identify it as such, right? We talked about that in Shepherding a Child's Heart a couple episodes ago, where adults then have to kind of come up with these categories and be like, this is sin, and this is the kind of sin, or here's the Bible verse antidote for this sin to get the sin rooted up. And I think it doesn't take long before you're zealously, like in a desire to be a good Christian parent, so far in that mindset that you don't have the bandwidth to question, because to consider something that doesn't operate out of those sin definitions does feel threatening to faith, I think, to underpinnings of Christian faith, in a way that an overwhelmed parent maybe is like, no, I can't explore this, or I'm afraid that leads to some kind of progressive deconstruction, where there's no idea that children can do something wrong, or I don't know. That's when I think a lot of the straw men pop up.
Yeah. Well, and I think there are some Christian parenting books that try to differentiate between don't punish a mistake, punish
Right.
rebellion or willful disobedience. But then you'll have this like, but also infants are capable of
Right.
willful wrongdoing because they manipulate you by crying. Right?
Yeah.
Like Larry
Yep.
Christensen's book, The Christian Family, talks about this explicitly. Like
Yeah.
infants will
A number
cry
of
to
them do. I
manipulate
came
you.
across that a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. Like infants will cry to manipulate you. They will scream to manipulate you. Yeah. It it feels to me like there's this like on the one hand wanting to pull back and seem reasonable, but
Mm.
then wanting to really quickly give complete control back to the parent and say, but you'll know like,
Yeah.
and an infant is capable of sin, so like don't get too loosey-goosey with that. With
Yeah.
there's the fear is that parents will be too permissive, um as opposed to fear that parents are going to be too disciplinarian.
Yes. And there's never, like, even if someone's willing to be like, well, no, but babies can't be rebellious, every single, I think, without exception, of of the popular Christian parenting resources is like, well, but the toddler years, we know for sure there's
Yes.
rebellion happening there. That's the no stage. And certainly, so it's kind of arbitrarily assumed that really any resistance to parental will or anything at odds with parental will is a sign of sin, which again goes back to this subtle shift that happens in Christian parenting resources that equates parents with a godlike role.
Hmm.
So an understanding that sin equals missing the mark of what God requires, or rebellion against God, or disobedience against God, that kind of one note understanding of sin. So to be like, if then a child doesn't do what the parent wants, fails to meet the requirements, or appears to be rebellious, then the child is sinning against the parent. Which is remarkable, I think, when we really put the spotlight on that, because it's a bit topsy-turvy.
Yeah. Yeah, I always think of Ann Holbert's book, Raising America, when we talk about this, because she identifies these different camps of parenting experts that have defined the landscape of
Mm-hmm.
American parenting advice since the beginning of the 20th
Mm-hmm.
century. And the camp that she puts James Dobson in, she calls it the parent-centered camp
Mm-hmm.
because it centers parental
Yes.
authority and parental will in a way that others do not.
Mm-hmm.
It's a unique feature of it, and that is still and the at times they're very explicit about that, because part
Mm-hmm.
of one thing that Dobson complains about often is how the kids these days walk all over their parents. We've got these parents that let their kids walk all over them, and that is a perennial thing that Christian
Yep.
parenting writers talk about, that every generation of kids is walking all over their parents. And I think that is so recurring just speaks to something about the experience of parenting kids,
I
right?
think
Like
so.
they have their own wills. You can either take that as an affront to your authority,
Yep.
or you can take it as a reality of that relationship that doesn't, I don't think it goes away. I mean, my
Right.
oldest is 7, so my experience is limited as a parent, but I think there are resources that really encourage parents to take challenges and disobedience as an affront to their God-given authority, to
Mm-hmm.
take it very personally and
Yes.
very cosmically, which is, we talk about upping the stakes all the time, and it
Yeah.
absolutely does.
It does. And it's this wild result where everything is adversarial.
Mm.
And you hear the language of winning in so many Christian parenting
Yes.
resources, and like
Yes.
somebody's got to win. And so it really elevates maybe the day-to-day power struggles that perhaps do happen in every family to these high stakes of, you have to win not just because you want to run your household the way you want to, but because it's God's designated order for the family. It's what we talked about last week. So it really also comes with this weight of really guilt for the parent if they don't establish that order, if they are too soft on their children. And so I think it comes at Christian parents from a lot of different angles. And also, I think if we're honest, probably bolsters something that feels pretty good in the difficult. You know what I mean? Like parenting, especially in the early years when a lot of parents are picking up these resources, is really hard and can be chaotic and feel like so much is out of control. So you have all these resources being like, not only here's the nice, tidy roadmap for you to follow, but also like you should take control. You should have authority. And if your child isn't listening, that's their rebellion. It's not you maybe need some more tools in your toolbox, or just that this is hard. It's going to be hard. I don't know. It makes me think of we were talking about a post Kelsey sent me on Instagram yesterday. We were messaging about which a Christian parent was saying, let's reject gentle parenting. And I'm pleading with parents to believe that first time disobedience is disobedience. Or I can't remember how they framed it, but is that how they framed it?
Yeah.
Something like that. And it was a long post, and the usual suspects of quoting scripture that places parents in the role of God and children in the role of like rebellious nations that have been warned many times. So it's kind of a ham-fisted parallel that happens. But in the comments that were almost unequivocally positive, one person was like, I'm going to show this to my 7 and 9-year-old because they've been really rebellious. I'm going to have them read this. And I thought, wow, that really encapsulates some of what's going on in a frustrated parent's heart. Like, I can't control my 7 and 9-year-old. And rather than that, maybe shaking up some beliefs I hold about what it means to be human, or the human will, or the human heart, like, I am going to remind my child that they're in rebellion against me, and in rebelling against me means rebelling against God and in need of swift punishment to get back into first time obedience line. And it's just a lot. It's a lot to think about a parent ingesting that and how it plays into, I think, our baser natures to feel good, to be empowered, to be in the one with all the power. And then what it's like to be a young child receiving that kind of messaging.
Yeah. Yeah. I think like it is so understandable, right? To want first time obedience.
Yeah. That would make everything really easier. For sure.
That would make everything so easy. And we talk a lot about how behaviorism in a lot of these cases really expects children to operate like robots or like pets. It's sort of like you can train and condition behavior. And, to be fair, in some cases, gentle parenting can kind of feel like it's asking something like that of parents, to put on this like almost robotic non-reactivity, or to have a level of like self-control that is not realistic. I've heard that criticism before, that like that gentle parenting, if you're really swimming in it, if you're really just diving into these resources and trying to do everything right, that it just is the heaviest burden, right? Like it can become its own kind of prosperity gospel. Like if you do all of these things right, if you get all of your stuff as a parent under control, you never overreact, you make yourself okay with every tantrum, you never yell, you never punish, your children will turn out right. But if you do this, you're going to mess up your child. If you do this,
it can be a heavy weight.
Traumatized. That can feel also unfair. Like, and so I do want to acknowledge that, like, I think it is also fair for some parents to look at what's being asked of parents when being asked to be like non-punitive. That can feel like that, like this is impossible. And some of these influencers who model this online do seem to have like a certain calmness. It's like, but I'm not like that. I'm not that kind
Right.
of person. I don't, I just don't think I can do that. And I think that's understandable
Right.
too. So I do want to like
Yeah, and I think
that.
too also the number of children matters. Like a parent's bandwidth to maybe do that with one or two is going to be really different. And I think that these became critiques of the attachment parenting movement as well, to be like, oh, okay, co-sleeping and long-term breastfeeding, maybe you can pull that off for one or two. But after a while, like, when is a parent going to sleep, right? That becomes the question. Or is there some middle ground between, the cry it out Ferber method and never trying to get your child to sleep on a schedule that parents can live in? And all of these things, when they become ideological, they can quickly, for sure, become heavy yokes in different ways that say, oh, you got to follow this prescription as well. And yeah, that's a good point. And I think so much of these teachings are subjectively consumed as well. So when you see think pieces that are trying to address, is gentle parenting biblical, the task set before that author is first, if they're doing a good job, they should try and define what that is, and then analyze it. And you see always in these things, it's kind of slippery because it maybe will be something they've anecdotally seen, or maybe they tried some approach for a year and it's their personal experience. Or maybe it's one influencer they follow. It's very difficult. It's why critiquing parenting philosophies is challenging, because it's impossible to say how much someone buys in or doesn't, how perfectly they employ something or not. So it gets kind of muddy as well. And I think at the heart of it, a lot of parents are just saying, I see in another method a critique of the method I'm using. So I don't like that.
That is exactly right. That's exactly right. And yeah, that's, I think people understandably are so defensive of their
Yeah,
parenting
it plays
choices,
into
whether
some
they're still actively
insecurities.
parenting or not,
Yeah.
It's, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. One other thing I wanted to say when we were talking about sin, I pulled up, Knost does have a chapter on sin. So I think with her book, and I don't know, I think it'd be great if there would be a newer edition that went a little more in depth in some of these things. I appreciate that she attempts to go deeper on some of the issues that the other books just surface. But in some ways it's misleading. Like when you asked about weaknesses, like this chapter, it's primarily word studies where she's pulling individual words from Bible. So there's still a lot of proof texting going on. It's a little bit more than the books that are just talking about sin without trying to define them. But I don't know. I had conflicted feelings about it when I reread it as we were researching, because I think the effort is so applaudable. And yet, in some ways, it equips people with things that won't hold water. And I think that can be problematic when the conversations become fraught. When there are people out to say, no, gentle parenting's not biblical, and people start getting down into word studies and things like this, it can, I don't know, it can get kind of exhausting for parents in a different way, to really feel like they have to have Bible verses to back everything up specifically.
Right. Well, when you say it doesn't hold water, what do you mean?
I mean, okay, let me see if I can find an example. So on page 119, she says, the Old Testament Hebrew words most often translated sin are chataha. I don't know. I'm not a Hebrew scholar, so I don't even know how to pronounce that, but which means missing the mark, and pasha, which means going beyond the limits. And she does have some sources. Then she says, in Greek, found in the New Testament, the word most often translated sin is hamartia, which means literally not a part of or has no share in. All in all, these words in their context in the original text of the Bible can be read to miss God's mark, to go beyond God's limits, to not be a part of God's will. Sin then is literally to depart from God, to operate outside of his nature. And it's not like that's wrong, but I think most biblical or theological scholars would say that's inadequate to
Mm.
kind of use a concordance to pull the verses and say, here's the operative definition of sin we're going to work from. So
Mhm.
I don't know. I think it can maybe lead to a false sense of like, now I know what the Bible really says about sin. I don't know. So I don't want to come on too hard, because I think, wow, this is a lot more depth than a lot of resources are doing that are regurgitating, but it's some of the same tools of proof
Mhm.
texting to make a case,
Mhm.
that even if the case is less objectionable, it's still those same tools that I would encourage readers to really just pause when they see that kind of approach. And this is something at the end of our book, we do have a metric of like how to evaluate resources for oneself, because I think that is the most hopeful tool we can give readers, rather than telling
Right.
you these are resources you should read or not, because
Right.
often there's a whole mixed up, maybe you'll find something useful in here, maybe not, but that would be one. Like, how is scripture handled? Is there a lot of proof texting, word study type approaches to make arguments, or is there a little bit more care saying, look, these are huge concepts we're trying to talk about, theological concepts that theologians for centuries have had differing viewpoints and theories on. So our attempts to make them manageable are certainly understandable, but I think my first response would be like, why are we trying to digest this all down to make then a point about a parenting philosophy?
Right.
Yeah, we maybe can get caught in that trap, and we don't need to. It can be
Mhm.
okay to say, I think the thesis of the book, which is we see gentleness in a kind of attached, connected, communicative discipleship modeled in in his interaction with his disciples, that we can aspire to as parents. Like, I think we can have that robustly without trying to force texts to fit, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that does make sense. And I I I'm trying to be fair to this
Right.
resource, because if we if we don't hold the ones that we generally are more comfortable with, at least the posture, to the same standard as the other ones, then that doesn't seem fair. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's
I,
always tricky with any of these resources. It becomes very tricky when biblical studies or attempts to look at scripture is then mixed up with something that is just objectively personal parenting preference.
yes.
And it's difficult because in Christian resources, it gets very muddy. So there are chapters in Knost books where she's just giving parenting advice or paradigms based on her experience
Mm,
and her approach that people may agree with or disagree with, but they're separate from the Bible. They fall under this category. She's saying that Jesus models this gentle approach, but her very practical advice is just her advice. So I think for readers it's a similar concoction that can lead to a kind of prosperity gospel promise, even if it's not intended to be, because scripture has very little to say about parenting. So I think there's a case to be made to say you have the freedom to choose a gentle approach. You have a freedom to choose an approach that lends more even authoritarian. The question is how you apply that. Do the methods you use align with general teaching in scripture of how we're to treat other people? But so I don't know. That's where it gets really muddy for me, even with resources like this that I think should be commended, particularly because they were rare unicorns in a sea of resources just hammering home authoritarian parenting. I think
yeah.
they should be applauded because it took a
Yes.
lot of courage and they received a lot of pushback, and I think still do.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think we, for probably the last, I don't know, 50, 70 years, at least in the Christian sphere, have been in an era of what the kids need is more
Yeah.
discipline. If you look at David Setrin's book on the history of Christian parenting in the US, he does a good job of outlining this back and forth between the answer going kind of oscillating between kids need more discipline and kids need more nurture.
Mm-hmm.
And the pendulum just swings back and forth between those things, usually spurred by social change, usually spurred by people in the church looking at social change and reacting to it,
Mm-hmm.
particularly when it swings back toward authoritarian parenting and the
Yeah.
rise of discipline. That usually tends to come from upheaval.
Mm.
We certainly saw that in the late 60s and early 70s. And I think we're still very much living in the aftermath of that.
Yeah.
Although we do have gentle parenting now, I think when you look at the preponderance of Christian parenting resources from the past 50 years,
Yeah.
they still very much
100%.
lean toward the kids need more. The problem is that they aren't getting enough discipline. The problem
Right.
is that they aren't getting enough discipline. And very rarely is it the more Victorian, Bushnellian
Mm-hmm.
nurture
Yeah.
as the more important piece. The missing piece is rarely more nurture.
Yeah.
Um,
Which
at
is
least,
unfortunate. Yeah.
yeah,
And I think
yeah,
plays into some myths there, like exactly as you've identified, that, oh, we have gotten softer. And I'm not sure it's the same myth that shows up when people are kind of like, well, parents aren't really spanking anymore, are they? And I'm like, I think there's some societal myths we have
Mhm.
that are based on anecdotes or assumptions people are making. Like if they see a child melting down in public, they're assuming that parent is soft with
Yeah,
very little data to even to even underscore that.
yes, yep.
As though it's the parents failing for a child to have a meltdown, and then dots are connected that get to this place of saying, well, any problem kids are having is because of, again, parental failure. But even the timeline of that just doesn't even align. There's gentle parenting as its own concept has not been around very long. Like even
Hmm.
if we pinpoint it to 2013, Sarah Ockham Smith or whatever, that's barely a decade. So
Right, right,
the idea that young adults are failing because of gentle parenting is just anachronistic. Like young
right.
adults today were not parented by gentle parenting metrics. Maybe some were attachment parented, perhaps.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, it doesn't necessarily add up.
Yeah,
One thing
that
I
makes it.
do like quite a bit about Knost's book is the cover, which
Hmm.
is an image of a man holding an infant, um, and kind of bare. It's just their head and shoulders, but kind of skin to skin. And it's quite striking with the title, including Jesus, because it's a visual image of a kind of tender masculinity that you just don't see a lot in Christian spaces,
Mm,
foregrounded, period, let alone in parenting books. And
mm,
I think that's maybe a conversation for a different episode, but that's a piece of this too. I do think there's a reaction against gentle parenting as something effeminate. And so,
mm,
from the corners of the church that decry the church being too feminine and the absence of masculine authority, there's
mm.
a knee jerk reaction to this idea of gentleness. So, I quite like that she chose that as kind of a visual image reminder that gentleness doesn't necessarily equal effeminate.
Mm. Interesting. I hadn't thought of that, but that makes sense as to why there might be a particularly strong backlash to it in this moment,
Yeah.
when there's sort of like panic about masculinity in the church
Yes.
and just about gender broadly, gender difference and
Well, and I hear a lot of, particularly in conservative Christian evangelical circles, you know, decrying the gynocracy or the longhouse, or,
yeah.
just these sort of like in the water terms that are now coming up of like
Yes.
women having too much say is a problem. And
Yes.
so I think the idea that gentle parenting is something maybe mothers are more drawn to is a mark against it in Christian
Yeah.
circles, for sure.
Yes. That is probably true also.
Yeah.
Hmm.
We do have, and I will link it in the show notes. We did one or two, maybe even Instagram live conversations last year about gentle
Yes.
parenting.
Yes.
So if you want more conversation on this topic, I will include them in the show notes.
Yes, I think in some, at least in one of those, we're responding to, and one of these is gentle
Yeah,
parenting biblical articles that comes up. I think it was from in the Gospel Coalition, if I
I
remember
think so.
correctly.
Yeah.
So yes, we have talked about this elsewhere before, and there's a lot more to say about it. If any of you see an interesting article about it and want to send it our way, we would
Yeah.
love to read it. We see this kind of content all the time, but it is interesting to see the responses and critiques of it.
It is. And have you noticed this too? I've noticed Christian influencers or parenting experts who maybe 5 years ago would have categorized themselves as gentle parenting are moving away from that. I think because of the
Mm.
negative pushback and trying to more precisely define whether it's intuitive parenting or respectful parenting or
Yes.
peacemaking parenting or whatever it is,
Yes, yes, yes.
because there's a whole contingent of young parents who are kind of like, ooh, gentle parenting, that's a slippery slope, or I can't
Yes.
touch that.
Yes, there's like a whole rebranding effort happening.
Mm-hmm.
And like to be fair, there's some like weird parenting content online, like people kind of platforming themselves and doing weird skits and like
Mm-hmm.
modeling these scripts that like yeah, in some cases they're like I mean just cringy in some
Right.
cases. But also some of them are like over the top or modeling something that just does not seem based in like a real interaction, which like
Mm-hmm.
kids are incredibly diverse, right? Like who's to say
Yes.
that someone doesn't have a child that might respond well to that? But of course, I have watched like TikToks where I'm kind of like, really? Like that
Right.
seems unrealistic or over the top. There's absolutely parenting content from all over the place like that out
Yeah.
there. So I do think there is this like semantics. No, it's respectful parenting. No, it's intuitive parenting. No, it's authoritarian. No,
Mm-hmm.
it's Dr. Becky's sturdy parenting. You know, like
Yeah.
everyone is looking for the perfect non-polarizing term that is palatable to a large group of parents
Yeah.
when they're building a platform. So that has its own problematic incentives as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's important to acknowledge that the problems in the online parenting space absolutely are still there. And I do think that is driving a lot of this conversation, though.
Mm-hmm. I think so too. And then, yeah, people try and parse it out, and then followers try and feel like, well, where am I at? Do I need to feel like I need to defend gentle parenting or
Right.
educate people? Or it continues. There's a reason it continues to cycle, because I think it stirs up really for everyone. I think at the core, it does stir up our own parental insecurities.
Yes, absolutely. Oh my
I
gosh.
think wherever you land on it, it's this feeling of like, oh, I either need to clarify that what I'm doing isn't this horrible, permissive, not, sin absent philosophy, or I need to clarify
Yes.
why it's really important to not be so child centric or whatever. And then you just have people dropping inflammatory things too. I saw one just this week where someone was just announcing that I think children should not have a say at all in the family menu or whatever. You're just like,
Yes.
why are we the way we are
I know.
as
Yes.
Christians and
Yes.
parents?
That's right. Yes, I know. Yes, I saw that. We must have a very similar. Maybe our algorithm is synced up at
I'm
this
sure
point.
at
I
this
don't know.
point.
Because I saw one of these too. Like it was like I didn't have a say what or no. I don't remember how it was framed. It was sort of like about why kids shouldn't have a say in dinner time. And like, oh, okay. Like if that's going to be your, I mean, sure. Just let's draw
Yeah,
a
well,
bright
and
line
in
from the
that
sand.
sense, for people who haven't read Jesus the Gentle Parent, maybe if it piques your curiosity, give it a read. I do think because of when Knost was writing, she does manage to avoid some of those pitfalls, because it was before all of those conversations and in the early days of articulating these ideas. And so it's less of a heated read in that sense. A lot of I think for the people, the podcasters who want to be like, gentle parenting isn't biblical, I think this would be a great read to be like, oh, I think there's a lot of things in here that most Christians would be like, oh no, this is good. Like listen to children instead of lecture at them, like encourage them. Like these are some pretty benign things that I think across the board, plenty of people would be like, oh yes, that's a value. So
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm glad we talked about this one.
Me
It
too.
was definitely, it's been on our list to talk about, and it's like a little departure from some of what we talk about with other
Right. We'll
resources.
have to
So,
sprinkle them in so that every
yes.
episode isn't just like, here's another heavy read.
Yes. Yes. We will. We will. We will. Um, I think maybe our next one, did we talk about doing Baby Wise
We
next?
did. And that one, hear from some of you. I've heard a number of people already asking us to do that one, Baby Wise and
Yes.
Growing Kids God's Way. So whether we do it as one long episode or two, maybe we'll do two, one on Baby Wise, one on Growing Kids God's Way. I think that one deserves quite a bit of conversation because of
Yeah.
how it felt like a zap influence. Like for a decade there, it was so influential in so many households.
Mm-hmm.
And then
So
it went
strong.
and then it kind of like went its own way. But for people who
Mhm.
were in it, whoo, they were in
Yeah.
it. So
Yep. Yeah, super influential, especially if you lived on the West Coast.
mhm.
I mean, even some like regional aspects of this one that we'll have to talk about. So I'm looking forward. I'm looking forward to that conversation, even though I know there are going to be some like icky parts of that conversation.
Yeah.
I am excited to talk about it with you.
Yeah.
Um, so we hope you all will join us next time. And as always, we are reachable on social media. Come find us. We'd love to know what books we should talk about, or if you see articles about this kind of stuff floating around, whether it's gentle parenting or new ideas new to you on Christian parenting. We'd love to
Mhm.
see those.
Yeah, and we'd love
Um,
to hear your experience, particularly with this topic, if you'd like to share, because I think this is a ongoing live one in ways some of the resources we talk about maybe aren't. So yeah, reach
yes,
out.
that is true. That is true. All right. So good to talk with you, Marissa.
You too. Thanks for joining us in the church library.
See you next time.
We are so glad you've joined us in the church library today. This is Marissa Franksbert.
And Kelsey Kramer McGinnis. And if you liked what you heard here, we think you'll be interested in reading our forthcoming book, The Myth of Good Christian Parenting: How False Promises Betrayed a Generation of Evangelical Families.
You can pre-order it now wherever books are sold, and it'll be on shelves in October of 2025.